The train to Savannah had been long and uneventful, the kind of journey Olivia Parker usually loved. There was something about the dull rhythm of wheels on rails, the gray skies flashing past her window, and the white noise of conversations around her that helped clear her mind. This time, though, her thoughts were anything but calm. The folder on her lap, a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings and hastily scrawled notes, held whispers of secrets that had refused to stay buried for over a decade. Olivia didn't know why she had agreed to this project when everything in her career pointed toward something bigger, something grittier and fast-paced. Maybe it was the suffocating chaos of New York City, the string of sleepless nights and cold coffee-fueled mornings. Or maybe it was the fact that Olivia had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Savannah promised just that: open skies, ocean breezes, and time. At least that was the illusion it sold. Olivia had learned long ago that charm often disguised shadows. When the cab pulled up in front of the Monroe Inn, Olivia was struck by how the building seemed to be a breathing entity. It wasn't the pristine perfection of a boutique hotel, it was better. Worn shutters framed the tall, arched windows, their once white paint now faded and peeling from years under the merciless southern sun. Creeping ivy clung to the brick exterior, twisting itself into patterns that seemed both beautiful and chaotic. An old sign swung lazily in the breeze. Monroe Inn, 1924. The place had history. Olivia stepped out, rolling her single suitcase behind her, and took a moment to look around. The air was thick and salty, tinged with the faint scent of jasmine that drifted from somewhere unseen. The heat pressed down on her shoulders like an unseen hand, heavier than anything she'd felt in the city. Beyond the inn she could see the coastline, where the Atlantic met the shore in a frothy, endless line. There was no hum of traffic, no shouting voices or blaring horns, only the cry of distant gulls and the rhythmic whisper of waves. It should have been peaceful, but something about it felt unsettling. She turned her gaze back to the inn just in time to see a figure emerge from behind the door. A woman. Olivia's breath hitched, not from any conscious realization, but from the sheer weight of the presence before her. The woman moved like smoke, effortless and quiet, as though she belonged to the air around her. She had an elegance that wasn't intentional, an innate grace paired with a sort of unspoken authority. Her hair was golden, swept loosely off her shoulders by the wind, and it caught the sun like liquid fire. But it was her face that held Olivia captive. Her features were delicate but sharp, a straight nose, high cheekbones, and a jawline that softened into something almost vulnerable. Her eyes, though, those were a different story. A piercing blue, sharp as glass, with a depth that suggested storms long past. "You must be Olivia Parker," the woman said. Her voice was low and rough, like gravel smoothed over silk. Olivia blinked, jolting herself out of whatever trance had held her. She managed a polite smile as she extended her hand. "That's me. You must be Elise Monroe." Elise didn't take her hand. Instead, her gaze lingered, studying Olivia in a way that was neither hostile nor welcoming, just assessing. Then, as though deciding something, she smiled. It wasn't a full smile, but a quick, wry twitch of her lips. "You journalists always come dressed for war," she remarked, eyeing Olivia's tailored pants, crisp white blouse and leather bag. "Come on in. You're probably wilting in this heat." Olivia didn't know how to respond to the subtle jab, so she didn't. Instead, she followed Elise into the inn. The interior was a study in contradictions. The floors were polished dark wood, the walls lined with family portraits and seascape paintings that seemed to watch Olivia as she passed. Dust motes floated lazily in the golden light streaming through tall windows, but everything else was meticulously clean, as though each surface had been wiped down just that morning. There were signs of life everywhere, flowers in chipped vases, newspapers left half-read on the coffee table, but there was something cold beneath it all, as if the house was clinging to a memory that refused to let go. Elise led her to the front desk, where an ancient guest book sat open, waiting for names to be written. "I've put you in room 312, she said, sliding a key across the polished counter. "Corner room. It gets a good breeze and the view's decent." "Thank you," Olivia said, hesitating. Elise's presence was so magnetic that standing this close to her felt like balancing on a wire. Olivia searched for something, anything, to fill the silence. "This place, it's beautiful." Elise's blue eyes flicked up to meet hers, and there was a flicker of something Olivia couldn't quite place, an almost amused glint. "It survived. That's more than I can say for most things around here. There it was. The first crack in Elise Munro's enigmatic surface. Olivia recognized it immediately. The comment was too deliberate, too pointed to be casual. Secrets had a way of leaving a mark on people, and Elise's words held the weight of something unspoken. "Dinner's at 7 if you want it," Elise added before Olivia could respond. "The dining room's down the hall. If you need anything, ask. Or don't. Most people find what they're looking for on their own." And with that she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the floor. That night Olivia found herself pacing her small room, her nerves frayed. The view from the corner window was as Elise had promised, breathtaking. The ocean stretched endlessly, its surface broken only by the shimmer of moonlight. The room itself was quaint, with faded floral wallpaper and a sturdy oak bed. It smelled faintly of lavender and sea salt, and yet there was a chill Olivia couldn't shake. She tried to focus on her notes, spreading papers across the small desk. Headlines jumped out at her. "Tragedy strikes Savannah. Young couple lost at sea. Storm claims 2, leaves questions unanswered." She stared at the black and white photographs of the victims, young, smiling faces captured in moments that seemed impossibly distant now. Her mind kept drifting though back to Elise Munro. Something about the woman felt strangely familiar, though Olivia knew that couldn't be possible. A sudden noise, soft footsteps outside her door, made her freeze. She turned, her pulse quickening. "Get it together," she scolded herself, brushing off the instinctive tension. She grabbed her notebook and headed downstairs, hoping a walk would clear her head. The inn's lower floor was dark except for a single lamp glowing in the corner of the sitting room. Elise stood near an open window, a glass of something amber in her hand, her profile bathed in silver moonlight. Her posture was relaxed, yet there was a heaviness to the way she stared into the night. Olivia hesitated in the doorway, feeling like an intruder. But Elise spoke without looking away. "Can't sleep." "No," Olivia admitted. "Too quiet, I guess." Elise turned her head just enough to look at her, her expression unreadable. "Quiet can be louder than you think depending on what you're running from." The words hit Olivia like a physical blow. Elise had a way of speaking that made her feel exposed, as though the other woman could see straight through her. "I'm not running," she replied carefully. Elise's lips curved into that same ironic smile Olivia was beginning to recognize. "Sure you aren't." The silence that followed was heavy. Olivia moved to stand beside Elise, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. From here, the ocean looked like an endless expanse of black, churning softly under the moon. "Are you looking for answers, Olivia? Or are you just looking for something to believe in?" Elise's voice was soft now, almost gentle, and it stirred something deep in Olivia's chest, something she hadn't felt in years. "I don't know yet," Olivia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Elise turned fully toward her then, her gaze locking with Olivia's. The space between them felt charged, the air vibrating with something unspoken and electric. "Be careful, Olivia," Elise murmured. "Sometimes the truth isn't what sets you free. It's what chains you forever." Olivia swallowed hard, unable to look away. In that moment she knew one thing for certain. Elise Munro was dangerous, not in any physical sense, but in the way she made Olivia feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind tugging at her heels. And she was starting to think she might just let herself fall. Part 2. The initial incident. The days in Savannah seemed to stretch endlessly, each hour colored by the golden light of the southern sun and the ever-present whisper of the ocean. Olivia had always prided herself on being a city woman, sharp, efficient, unrelenting. But Savannah had a way of slowing time, of pulling at the edges of her carefully curated exterior. Her investigations, which once felt like a series of precise, logical steps, now felt more like wandering through fog, each lead bringing her closer to something she couldn't quite see but could feel lingering just out of reach. And at the center of it all was Elise Munro. Over the past week Olivia had learned enough to confirm her instincts. Savannah was a town wrapped tightly in its own secrets, a place where the past sat just beneath the surface like a ripple on still water. Locals spoke of Elise in hushed tones, their voices tinged with something that felt like both reverence and fear. And then there were the rumors. An accident years ago, whispers of tragedy that had permanently etched itself into the Munro name. It was just the kind of story Olivia had been sent to uncover, but this time the truth felt different. Heavier. It was over a tense breakfast in the Monroe Inn's sunlit dining room that the first pieces fell into place. The morning light poured in through the tall, arched windows, scattering golden streaks across the worn wooden floor. Olivia sat at a table in the corner, flipping through the local archives she'd managed to pull together. Each brittle newspaper clipping told fragments of the same story. 15 years ago, during an unexpected storm, a boat had gone missing off the Savannah coast. 2 lives were lost, a young man named Andrew Monroe and his girlfriend Lily Ward. The reports were brief, almost clinical, but the details were haunting. They had been young, full of promise. And Elise Monroe's name had appeared once in connection to the tragedy. Younger sister of the deceased, Elise Monroe, was present during the recovery efforts but has declined to comment. It was a small, nearly insignificant line, but it clung to Olivia's mind like a burr. Present. What did that mean? And why had Elise refused to speak? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Elise entered the room carrying a fresh pot of coffee, and Olivia felt her heart stutter, like it always seemed to when Elise appeared. Dressed in a simple loose blouse tucked into faded jeans, her hair falling carelessly over her shoulders, Elise was the kind of woman who seemed entirely unbothered by the world's expectations. There was something inherently magnetic about her, something that made it impossible to look away. "Good morning," Elise said softly, her voice still rough from sleep. "Morning," Olivia replied, her throat suddenly dry. Elise poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table across from Olivia. The silence between them felt comfortable at first, punctuated only by the faint hum of cicadas outside and the distant sound of the waves. But then Olivia's eyes fell back to the folder in front of her, to the headlines and names that now seemed to carry Elise's shadow. Her curiosity gnawed at her. She tried to push it down, but it rose anyway. "Can I ask you something?" Olivia said finally, keeping her voice casual. Elise looked up, her expression guarded but calm. "Depends on what it is. There was an accident. About 15 years ago." Olivia paused, watching for Elise's reaction, but the woman gave nothing away. "I found a few articles about it. A boat went missing. Andrew Monroe and Lily Ward. I didn't realize he was your brother." For a moment the room felt as though it had lost all its air. Elise's hand, which had been cradling her coffee cup, froze. The light in her blue eyes shifted, darkened, like a storm cloud had passed over them. Her jaw tightened just enough for Olivia to see it before Elise set her cup down with deliberate care. "That's the kind of thing that should stay where it is. Buried," Elise said, her voice low and steady, but sharp enough to cut through Olivia's resolve. "Elise, I didn't mean to." But Elise was already rising from her chair, her movements precise and measured, though her eyes burned with something raw and unspeakable. "You always do mean to, don't you?" she said quietly, her tone a mix of bitterness and something far more vulnerable. "That's what people like you do, dig until there's nothing left but a grave." Before Olivia could respond, Elise turned on her heel and left the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the inn like a distant drumbeat. Olivia sat frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had seen 100 reactions in her time as a journalist: defensiveness, anger, sadness, but this had been different. Elise's pain had been so palpable it left the air around her heavy, and Olivia found herself desperate to know more. Not just for her story but for reasons she couldn't quite admit to herself. That night, a storm rolled in, as sudden and furious as the tension that had lingered between Olivia and Elise all day. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled through the cracks in the old building. The power went out just past midnight, plunging the Monroe Inn into complete darkness. Olivia fumbled for the lantern Elise had left in her room earlier. The small flame illuminated the space in flickering shadows, making everything feel otherworldly. She hesitated at first, but something about the darkness, about the relentless storm outside, drove her to leave her room. The sitting room downstairs was lit by a cluster of candles on the mantel, their soft glow revealing Elise sitting alone in an armchair by the window. Her legs were tucked up under her and she held a glass of whiskey in her hand, the amber liquid catching the candlelight. Her face was pensive, shadowed in ways that made her look both older and more fragile than Olivia had seen before. "You couldn't sleep either?" Olivia asked softly, stepping into the room. Elise didn't look up. "Storms are funny, aren't they? They always sound like they're trying to remind you of something." She swirled the whiskey in her glass. "Or someone." Olivia hesitated, then placed the lantern on the low coffee table and sat across from her. Elise. I didn't mean to upset you earlier. I'm sorry. Elise finally looked at her, her gaze holding Olivia in place. Do you ever think about stopping, Olivia? About not looking so deeply into people? Her voice was quieter now, softer, and it sent a shiver through Olivia's chest. Sometimes what you find isn't worth the price. That's not who I am, Olivia replied honestly. I don't stop. Elise's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. That's what I thought. The silence between them stretched again, but this time it felt different. Intimate, almost suffocating in its weight. Elise leaned forward suddenly, her long fingers picking up the lantern Olivia had brought with her. She lifted it carefully, the flame illuminating Olivia's face. Caution, Olivia, Elise whispered, her voice a breath. Some secrets are heavier than you realize. The light made Elise's features sharper, her blue eyes reflecting the flicker of the flame in a way that made them look almost unreal. For a second Olivia forgot to breathe. Elise, she started, her voice trembling slightly, though she wasn't sure what she wanted to say. The distance between them seemed to disappear. The air grew thick, electric. Olivia could see the way Elise's chest rose and fell, her breath unsteady matching her own. The moment hovered, fragile and dangerous. But then, as if snapping out of a trance, Elise stood abruptly. The spell broke. You should go back to bed, Elise said, her voice cold now, distant. Before you regret being here. She disappeared into the shadows before Olivia could say a word, leaving her sitting there with her heart pounding and the undeniable realization that she was falling hard for the woman who carried the kind of secrets that could ruin them both. Part 3, Development. The days following that stormy night at the Monroe Inn unraveled in a blur of sunlight and shadows, a strange mix of progress and frustration that Olivia couldn't quite explain. Savannah, with its lush landscapes and thick, oppressive heat, had begun to reveal itself as both beautiful and haunting. The town's charm was deceptive, its stillness hiding stories no one wanted to tell, stories that Olivia now felt obligated to chase. Each morning she would wake to the salty air drifting in through her window, the hum of cicadas already vibrating through the trees. Her days were consumed by chasing leads, hours spent in dusty archives at the town's public library, speaking to weathered locals whose lips were often pressed into thin lines of silence, and combing through old newspaper reports that repeated the same chilling tale. 2 lives lost. A storm no one saw coming. And one family, the Monroes, forever marked by tragedy. It was always the same cycle. Questions met with reluctant answers. People didn't talk about Andrew Monroe or Lily Ward, as though the memory of them had become some sort of specter. When Olivia brought up Elise, they grew colder. Some pitied her. Others dismissed her entirely, muttering phrases like "that poor girl" or "best left alone." Olivia was starting to realize that Elise Monroe was not just a survivor. She was also the town's unspoken cautionary tale. But Olivia couldn't leave it alone. Not just because of the story she was meant to write, but because of Elise herself. Elise Monroe had become a contradiction Olivia couldn't untangle, a puzzle of warmth and ice that kept her on edge. Some days Elise was kind, unexpectedly so. Like the afternoon Olivia got turned around in the coastal woods, miles of winding paths and whispering branches disorienting her until she felt truly lost. She had sat on a fallen log, frustration boiling over, when Elise had appeared as though from nowhere, stepping into view with a calm Olivia both envied and resented. You city people really don't know when to turn around, Elise had teased, offering a hand to pull Olivia up. Her touch had been steady, warm despite her sharp words. Maybe I just don't quit, Olivia had replied, brushing dirt from her jeans. Elise had sighed, shaking her head. That'll get you into trouble someday, Olivia Parker. Her tone had been light, but there was something behind it, an unspoken warning Olivia couldn't ignore. Elise led her back through the woods, their footsteps the only sound besides the distant crash of waves. Olivia had stolen glances at her along the way, memorizing the sharp line of her jaw, the way her hair glowed in streaks of gold when sunlight filtered through the trees. Why did you come back for me? Olivia had asked when they reached the edge of the woods. Elise's response had been a quiet shrug. Couldn't let you disappear out here, could I? That had been the moment Olivia's walls had cracked even more. But just when she felt herself drawing closer, Elise would push her away. At breakfast she would be distant, her gaze cold and impenetrable. In the evenings Olivia would hear Elise pacing the halls of the inn, her footsteps soft but restless. It was as though Elise carried a weight that threatened to crush her, and she didn't trust Olivia, or anyone, to help her bear it. It was on a stiflingly hot afternoon that Olivia finally pushed too far. She had been following a trail of vague answers all morning, speaking to locals who hinted at something Elise had never told her, that Elise Monroe had been on that boat the night it disappeared. The whispers were sparse and incomplete, but they lodged themselves in Olivia's mind like splinters. She spent the next few hours searching the outskirts of the Monroe Inn's sprawling property. There were places Elise rarely visited, abandoned barns, overgrown trails and empty sheds, and Olivia suspected one of them might hold answers. She found Elise in the old barn at the edge of the property, a crumbling structure shrouded by weeping willows and wild vines. The inside was awash of dust and golden light filtering through gaps in the wood. Elise stood by the wide-open doors, staring out at the horizon where the sky melted into the sea. She looked lost, her figure small against the vastness of the world outside. "Elise," Olivia said softly, stepping over the threshold. Elise didn't turn, but Olivia could see the tension in her shoulders. "I'm not in the mood for company, Olivia. I've been asking questions," Olivia pressed, carefully measuring her words as she approached. "People are saying things about that night. About you." At that, Elise turned sharply, her expression hard and unreadable. "What exactly are they saying?" Olivia hesitated. "That you were on the boat." The silence that followed felt like a living thing, pressing in on Olivia until she could barely breathe. Elise's eyes darkened, her jaw set in a tight line. "You don't know when to stop, do you?" Elise's voice was low, dangerous. "Why won't you talk to me about it?" Olivia pushed. "Why do you keep running from it?" "Because people like you never understand," Elise snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You think the truth is something everyone wants. But it isn't. Not always. Elise, I'm just trying to help." "Help?" Elise let out a bitter laugh. "You're not helping me, Olivia. You're digging. And you're getting too close. Why won't you let me get close?" Olivia's voice rose, frustration boiling over. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" Elise stared at her for a long moment, something fierce and raw flickering behind her eyes. Then, without warning, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Because not everyone wants to be saved," Elise whispered, her voice trembling with something Olivia couldn't name. And before Olivia could say another word, Elise grabbed her, fingers curling tightly around her arms, and pulled her closer. The kiss that followed was a collision of everything unsaid between them: anger, desire, fear. Elise's lips were hot and insistent, her breath mingling with Olivia's as though she was trying to pour all her secrets into her. Olivia froze at first, overwhelmed, but then she melted into it, her hands gripping Elise's waist as though anchoring herself to something real. When they broke apart, both women were breathless. Elise stared at Olivia, her blue eyes wide and filled with something that looked like regret. She stepped back, running a shaking hand through her hair. "This doesn't change anything," Elise muttered, her voice hollow. "Elise." But Elise turned and walked out of the barn, leaving Olivia alone with the scent of dust and salt air, and the lingering taste of something both bitter and sweet. That night, driven by the weight of the kiss and the questions Elise wouldn't answer, Olivia searched Elise's private office. It wasn't something she was proud of, but desperation drove her to it. Hidden at the back of a drawer under stacks of paperwork and receipts, she found it. A letter. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged, but it was clear enough. It described the storm, the chaos, and, most painfully, how Elise had been on the boat that night and had survived. Olivia sat with the letter in her hands, her chest tight. The truth was heavy even for her. When Elise found her minutes later, Olivia didn't try to hide it. "You knew," Olivia whispered, holding up the letter. "You were there." Elise's face crumpled, and for the first time Olivia saw her truly break. Tears filled Elise's eyes as she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "I was the only one who came back," Elise choked out. "It was my fault. I tried to save them, but I couldn't. I was so scared and her voice broke. I've been carrying it ever since." The confession hung heavy in the air, the room filled with the sound of Elise's quiet sobs. Olivia watched her, her own heart breaking. In that moment, Olivia realized that her feelings for Elise had nothing to do with solving the mystery. He wanted to protect her, to understand her, and maybe, just maybe, to love her. Part 4. Climax and Resolution. The decision weighed on Olivia like lead in her chest. She sat at the small desk in her room at the Monroe Inn, her notes scattered across the surface, the half-written draft of her article staring back at her from the glowing screen of her laptop. Outside, Savannah's oppressive heat clung to the world like a shroud, the air thick and unmoving. Olivia's pulse raced with every word she typed. The story, Elise's story, was within her grasp, the kind of revelation that could solidify her career. And yet, every sentence felt like a betrayal. The sound of the ceiling fan hummed above her, rhythmic and faintly unsettling. Olivia leaned back in the chair, rubbing her eyes as her thoughts tangled together. She had come to Savannah chasing a scandal, but now she was tangled up in something far deeper than she ever anticipated. Elise Monroe wasn't just a survivor of tragedy. She was a woman who had spent her entire life haunted by a storm she couldn't escape. And Olivia had fallen for her, deeply, irreversibly. That night the fire came. It started with the faint smell of smoke, a sharp acrid tang that seeped through the open window and pulled Olivia from her restless half-sleep. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. But when she opened her eyes, the orange glow flickering at the edges of the curtains confirmed her worst fear. The Monroe Inn was burning. Panic jolted through her veins like electricity. Olivia jumped from the bed, yanking the door open to find the hallway clouded with smoke. The faint crackling of flames echoed from somewhere below, a monstrous sound that swallowed everything else. "Elise!" Olivia shouted, her voice hoarse already as she ran down the hall, her bare feet slamming against the wood. The smoke stung her eyes and filled her lungs as she searched desperately. The flames were spreading quickly, hungry and relentless, licking their way up the walls and ceiling. Heat pressed against her skin, suffocating and unbearable. "Elise!" she screamed again, louder this time, her voice trembling with fear. Finally she saw her. Elise was at the far end of the hall, stumbling out of a smoke-filled room. She looked disoriented, her face streaked with soot, one hand pressed to her forehead where a thin line of blood dripped down. She coughed violently, her body doubled over as the smoke clawed at her throat. Olivia ran to her without thinking, the flames closing in around them. "Elise! Olivia!" Elise's voice was barely a whisper, her blue eyes wild and unfocused. "You shouldn't be here. Come on," Olivia urged, grabbing Elise's arm and pulling her upright. "We have to get out of here." Elise swayed for a moment, her knees nearly giving out, but Olivia held her steady. Together they stumbled down the staircase, the wood creaking and splintering beneath them as the fire roared. The front door was barely visible through the dense, billowing smoke, and Olivia's lungs burned with every breath. At the last second, just as the ceiling above groaned ominously, threatening to collapse, they broke through the front door and into the night. Cool air hit Olivia's face like a shock as they stumbled onto the lawn, collapsing into the dewy grass. Elise coughed hard, her body shaking as Olivia hovered beside her, her hands trembling as she checked for injuries. The Monroe Inn was engulfed in flames now, its windows glowing like molten gold against the inky blackness of the night sky. The fire crackled and roared, consuming everything in its path, walls, memories, secrets. "No," Elise whispered, staring at the inferno. Her voice was hollow, broken. "No, it's gone." Olivia looked at her, her chest tightening. Elise sat up, her face streaked with sweat and soot, her blue eyes reflecting the flames. There was something in her expression that Olivia had never seen before, a bone-deep weariness, as though the fire had burned straight through to her soul. Elise's hands trembled as she pressed them against the grass, her voice shaking. Everything I kept. It's just a building," Olivia said softly, though the words felt empty even as they left her lips. "You're alive. That's what matters." Elise turned her head to look at Olivia, and for a long moment she said nothing. Her gaze was piercing, searching, but Olivia didn't look away. The world seemed to slow around them, the fire raging behind them, the stars bright and cold overhead. Finally Elise spoke. "You don't understand, Olivia. It wasn't just a building. It was everything I had left of them." The words were like a blow to Olivia's chest. Elise's shoulders sagged, her hands balling into fists as tears streaked down her soot-covered cheeks. That night, she began, her voice so soft Olivia had to lean closer to hear. The storm came out of nowhere. My brother, Andrew, he wanted to take the boat out. Lily was so excited. I told them it was reckless, but I went anyway. Thought I could, I don't know, keep them safe maybe. Olivia held her breath as Elise continued, her voice growing weaker. The waves, they were too strong. Andrew lost control of the boat, and when it tipped, I tried to save them. I grabbed Lily's hand, but the water pulled her under. And Andrew, Elise's voice broke. I saw him disappear. One moment he was there and then he was just gone. I don't even know how I made it back to shore. I swam and I didn't stop. And when I got there I couldn't face it. I couldn't tell anyone what happened. I let them all think it was just the storm, just a tragic accident, because admitting the truth would mean admitting that I failed them. The confession hung in the air, heavy and devastating. Olivia reached for Elise's hand, squeezing it gently. It wasn't your fault, Elise. Elise shook her head, tears still streaming. I left them. I survived when I shouldn't have. I've spent 15 years trying to atone for something I can never fix. Olivia felt her own throat tighten, her heart breaking for the woman sitting before her. Elise had been carrying this weight alone for so long, punishing herself for a mistake that wasn't hers to bear. Olivia had come to Savannah searching for a story, but what she had found was so much more, Elise in all her broken beauty. The next day, as the ashes of the Monroe Inn smoldered and the local fire department packed up their equipment, Olivia sat beside Elise on the beach. The wind was soft, the waves rolling in quietly as though mourning the loss of the old building. Elise stared out at the horizon, her arms wrapped around her knees. I'm going to publish the story, Olivia said carefully. But not the way you think. Elise turned her head, frowning slightly. What do you mean? Olivia pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag and handed it to Elise. This is for you. Elise unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the words Olivia had written. Sometimes the past must stay where it is. The only truth that matters now is who you choose to be moving forward. Elise's gaze lifted to Olivia, her expression a mixture of surprise and something softer, something like relief. You're not publishing it? Olivia shook her head. No. This isn't a story for the world, Elise. It's yours. Elise's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached out and took Olivia's hand, squeezing it tightly. The two of them sat in silence as the sun began to set, its golden light spilling across the ocean like liquid fire. A week later, Olivia drove back toward New York. The city skyline felt impossibly distant as she sped down the open highway, her thoughts lingering in Savannah. She had left a part of herself there, left it with Elise. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. When she glanced at the screen, her breath caught. It was a photo, Elise standing on the beach, the wind in her hair, her lips curved into a genuine, breathtaking smile. Olivia had never seen her smile like that before. Beneath the image was a single caption. There's still time for you to come back. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in a long time she smiled. And she knew, her story with Elise wasn't over yet.